One of my favorite pastimes of the past year has been poker, Texas Hold'em specifically. I'm not a natural strategic mastermind, like my wife, when it comes to strategy games of any sort. Texas Hold'em is no exception. Over the past year, I've been learning how to play poker from six-time World Series champion Daniel Negreanu. Negreanu is one of many renowned experts that Masterclass has to teach you how to do what's important to you. I've been watching Negreanu's nearly 30 lessons on poker, embedded with many of his examples from TV tournaments spliced in. Daniel Negreanu's Masterclass on Texas Hold'em has really helped me grow fundamentally sound at Texas Hold'em. There are hundreds of other experts who can help you grow various professional skills or your abilities in various hobbies. Check out Masterclass today using my link in the show notes. If you treat yourself to Masterclass using that link, you'll also be supporting the show. Now, onto our show.
This is Forgotten Wars.
Many of us together in this audio medium share sympathy and even respect for characters, fictional and especially actual, who fight for the underdog. It's stirring to watch someone refuse to stand by and just let the weak be run over. It's stirring to read about someone reaching a point in their life when they decide to use their privilege, their power, their abilities to stand up for the exploited. It's stirring to learn about those who count the cost of taking the weak's side and count that cost worthwhile. These characters are never perfect and often animated by other motives. One of our characters today may fit this hero who sacrifices for the weak archetype. But the historical record is far from unanimous on this.
Under the British flag, you will have everything you desire. But that flag will continue to fly over the land.
Over the land, maybe. Over the people, never. You will see me in the field, fighting for our independence, long after you and your party who make war with your mouths have fled the country.
I don't think the Boers will have a chance.
Disarm your blacks. Act the part of a white man in a white man's war.
Civilized war is awful.
Many in British leadership still stood in shock after the Pretoria Convention was ratified. The British Empire's Queen Victoria thought this convention a capitulation to the Boers. Oh, what she must have thought when the Transvaal quickly defaulted on the £500,000 debt they'd agreed to pay. Oh, how the Queen must have raged when the Boers quickly violated their new borders. How could the Transvaal, the South African Republic that could not even afford to pay the travel costs of its Volksraad members, have defeated the mighty British Empire? How could a little, backwards, republic with maybe 40,000 whites have defeated British armies over and over and over again? Though the British government lost hope of winning the First Boer War, they kept hope alive for a united South Africa influenced by the Cape Colony. A united South Africa would be the cheapest way to ensure British dominance there and ensure South African progress. A united South Africa would mean a united economy and a communications system that would encourage foreign investment and thus more trade and revenue for the British Empire in the long run. A united South Africa would facilitate easier flow of African labor. A united South Africa would resolve local conflicts, at least in theory. The Transvaal Boers were rankled by the Pretoria Convention too. In their first Volksraad meeting after the Pretoria Convention's signing, one member described the convention as a cup of milk with 33 flies in it, referring to the 33 articles of this convention. They coveted the absolute independence that their Orange Free State neighbors had enjoyed since the Bloemfontein Convention of 1854. Before long, the Transvaal ignored the Pretoria Convention's border limits and defaulted on the £500,000 debt they had agreed to pay in the treaty. The Zulu and Bapedi kingdoms suffered crushing blows in the late 1870s. Less than 2 years after the Pretoria Convention's ratification, the South African Republic dealt more crushing blows. The Transvaal Boers focused on reducing neighboring native tribes to submission, as speedily and cheaply as possible. Take Nyabela's Nzunza clan, for example. Nyabela's father, Chief Moghoho, built the tribal headquarters at Konomchareelo within a geographic area perfect for defense, an area replete with ravines, hills, boulders, and caves. The Nzunza doubled down on this defensive climate by building interlocking fortresses, underground bunkers, rock barriers, and tunnels traveling up to 1 kilometer. The Boers extracted land taxes from the Nzunza until Chief Moghoho, known as Mapok by the Boers, threw off this yoke in the 1860s in a war of attrition. Afterwards, the Transvaal recognized Nzunza jurisdiction over Nzunza land bordering the South African Republic's Middelburg district. The Boers and Nzunza even joined forces during the Sekhukhune Wars in the late 1870s. You heard about these in episode 6. But after the Boers defeated the British in the Transvaal Rebellion, the Boers finally mustered the strength and unity to try to put the Nzunza under their thumb again. The Transvaal was still sore over the Nzunza flexing their independence by refusing to hold a Transvaal-ordered census, refusing to allow the Boers to beacon off Nzunza land, and refusing to pay taxes to the Transvaal. The Nzunza ultimately delivered the provocation for war the Boers were looking for when the Nzunza decided to harbor a fugitive, Mampuru. You might remember Mampuru from episode 6. Mampuru's half-brother, Sekhukhune, murdered all of Mampuru's royal advisors because Sekhukhune wanted the Bapedi throne. Thus, Sekhukhune assumed the Bapedi throne, and Mampuru escaped with his life. As you can imagine, Mampuru didn't get along with Sekhukhune well after this. In mid-1882, some of Mampuru's followers attacked Sekhukhune's village and murdered Sekhukhune. This fomented the kind of disorder on the border that the Transvaal twice before had tried, but failed to arrest Mampuru for. Mampuru and his supporters pled for refuge from one of Nyabela's subordinate chiefs. When the Transvaal demanded that Nyabela extradite Mampuru, Nyabela dated his tribe's death warrant. He refused to give up Mampuru to the Boers. This fed rumors that Nyabela and Mampuru were plotting a black uprising within the Transvaal. The Volksraad gave one of our main characters from before the authorization to get Mampuru and eventually to subjugate any blacks who assisted Mampuru. General Piet Joubert was thrilled about this and systematically prepared for this objective. Joubert raised 2,000 Boers to demand once more that Mampuru be given up. Nyabela would not comply. The Nzunza rallied to the formidable Konomchareelo fortress prepared to endure Boer attacks and even sieges. Joubert's forces had little interest in this war and even less interest in frontal attacks on Konomchareelo. Joubert planned to encircle and starve the tribesmen into submission. Quickly assembled forts and far-reaching artillery enabled encirclement. The Nzunza suffered heavy losses when they tried to overcome these forts. The Nzunza tried to negotiate peace after these losses, but refused to risk Nyabela's capture by sending him in person to negotiate terms. The natural fortress of Twapondo saw the Boer forces swelled by hundreds of Bapedi loyal to the slain Sekhukhune. But Twapondo saw the first Boer defeat during an unexpected Nzunza counterattack. But Joubert's forces held the advantage and upper hand throughout the war. By February 1883, the writing on the wall grew more stark for Nyabela. The Boers tightened their noose around Konomchareelo. The Boers sought to preserve their own lives at the cost of extending the war. How? The Boers tried unsuccessfully many times to dynamite the Nzunza into submission. Boers used dynamite quite a bit in this war. This time, Joubert and his war council decided to dig a trench up to the base of Konomchareelo's mountain, tunnel far underneath the mountain, and hopefully lay enough dynamite to bring the fortress crashing down. Historian David Sachs describes this strategy memorably as, quote, A bizarre and tortuous strategy, certainly amongst the most curious ever to have been devised in modern warfare." End quote. The same Stephanus Ruus, who led a decisive war charge over the top at Machuba, took part in this dynamiting operation. Commandant Stephanus Ruus was shot dead while dynamiting the cave. The digging continued, but what continued with greater significance was the Nzunza drift towards starvation. Many chiefs surrendered, but Nyabela refused to surrender even after Boer promises to spare his life and allow his people to remain on their land. So the digging continued, and most Boers propped their feet up at their respective forts waiting for the war to be over. The Nzunza harassed the diggers as much as they could, and thus delaying the war's end by weeks. Betrayal forced the Boers to innovate. A Scottish member of a commando named Donald MacDonald defected to the Nzunza. According to rumors, the Nzunza bought MacDonald's defection with diamonds stolen from Kimberley diamond fields by Nzunza laborers. What is not doubted is that MacDonald proved himself useful to the Nzunza. Ironically, MacDonald led this Mapoke war deeper in descent into medieval tactics. For example, he forced the Boers to start using mobile iron forts to protect diggers. Why? Because the Nzunza started catapulting large boulders under MacDonald's direction on the Boer diggers. The Boer diggers finally reached the base of Konom Charaelo and penetrated beneath until they reached a bed of rock that they couldn't penetrate. So all this digging and tunneling were for naught. The Nzunza stubbornly held on and launched another daring raid on Boer kraals that netted 200 oxen to keep the tribesmen from starving. So now it's June of 1883, and some of the Boers are frustrated. Remember, these Boers are not full-time soldiers. These Boers have left their farms or other businesses for weeks or even months to go fight this war that wasn't even a defensive war, and certainly not as compelling as their recent war of independence. So 70 Boers stepped up and volunteered to charge up Spitzkope and overcome the Nzunza defenders and get this war over with. The Boers charged and closed in on the crest of Spitzkope. Then, 15 meters from the crest, a hail of stones pummeled the Boer attackers and drove the attackers back the way they'd come. So, Nzunza destruction was staved off. Finally, on July 8th, Nyabela decided that now was the time to give up Mampuru. The Boers happily received Mampuru, but it was too little, too late. The war had cost the Boers over 40,000 pounds, several dozen lives, and months away from work and home for Boer soldiers. Unconditional surrender was all Joubert would accept, and this Joubert got 2 days after receiving Mampuru. Nyabela and his 8,000 tribesmen kept their lives but lost their freedom. Those Boers who fought in the campaign received nearly 20 acres of Nzunza land each. The post-war settlements scattered the Nzunza across the Transvaal as indentured laborers, basically as slaves on renewable 5-year contracts. Mampuru was tried and hanged. Nyabela also received a death sentence until the British government convinced the Boers to reduce it to a life sentence. Nyabela ended up winning release after only 15 years, but died on December 19th, 1902 near Pretoria. Every year on the anniversary of Nyabela's death, many Nzunza descendants gather at the Konom Charaelo caves to honor their ancestors and to commemorate Nyabela and tribal freedom fighters. 1970 even saw a statue of Nyabela erected at the foot of Konom Charaelo in the presence of Chief David Maghoho, a descendant of Nyabela. If you would like to help keep Forgotten Wars producing and growing, would you do at least 2 of 3 things? First, would you share a link to the podcast with someone you think might enjoy it? Second, if you're listening on Spotify, Google Podcasts, or other providers, would you make sure to like or follow our podcast? If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, would you give us a 5-star rating and write a thoughtful review there? You can even do that while you're listening. Lastly, if you want more from the show, bonus episodes, behind-the-mic access, transcripts and sources, and much more, and you want to support the show, check out our Patreon page at patreon.com/ForgottenWars. That is patreon.com/ForgottenWars. The link is also in this episode's notes. Thanks to those of you who have done one of these things already. Know that you're appreciated. Now, back to our episode. After the First Boer War, a major economic depression struck South Africa, driving many Boers of the Transvaal into poverty, especially those dependent on hunting. Acquiring more land looked very appealing to these Boers. After defeating the British 2 years earlier, many in the Transvaal wanted to expand the Republic's borders and made the gamble that the British would not be willing to strictly enforce borders set by the Pretoria Convention. This gamble paid off when the Boers subjugated the Nzunza in the previously mentioned Mapoke War of 1882 to 1883. The gamble paid off again along the Transvaal's western border, at least for a time. It is quite possible that one man's death ultimately sealed the fate of this gamble. Some Transvaal Boers put the Pretoria Convention to the test again by going to war with Tshwane chiefs Monsoya and Mankuruane, and eventually setting up the settlements of Stellaland and Goshen. Chief Monsoya provided the original excuse for part of an invasion when he took advantage of the Transvaal Rebellion by conquering the settlement of Loklaclane, just west of the Transvaal. Chief Monsoya conquered land ripe for farming and replete with a route to diamond fields in Kimberley. Chief Monsoya drove the Rapulana and Rotlo Rolong eastward out of this land into the arms of the Transvaal Boers. The settlement of Loklaclane sat on a seesaw of sorts. The Boers drove the Rapulana and Rotlo Rolong out of the Orange Free State and the Transvaal in the mid-1870s. So the Rapulana and Rotlo Rolong moved northwest and made Loklaclane their new home in the mid-1870s. But why was Loklaclane available for the Rapulana and Rotlo Rolong? Decades earlier, Chief Monsoya's people had made Loklaclane their capital, but Boer raids drove away Chief Monsoya's people in the early 1850s. So depending on how far back you walk this story, you can definitely see why Chief Monsoya thought he had a right to take Loklaclane. But the Rapulana and Rotlo Rolong and opportunistic Boer volunteers did not see it this way. After losing Loklaclane, the Rapulana and Rotlo requested Transvaal Boer assistance. So in November 1881, the Rapulana and Rotlo and some Boer mercenaries drove Chief Monsoya and his Shidi out of Loklaclane. Many of these Boer mercenaries were actually draft dodgers of a different sort. Many of these invading volunteers evaded service in the previously mentioned Mapoke War of 1882 to 1883 by trying to score some Tshwane land as mercenaries. After driving Chief Monsoya and his Shidi out of Loklaclane, the Boer mercenaries besieged Chief Monsoya's forces at Mafeking. Yes, the Mafeking our first episode focused on. Chief Monsoya fought to within inches of starvation until his signature was likely forged on a treaty granting the Boer mercenaries land that the Republic of Goshen would be established on. Some Boer mercenaries took advantage of intertribal conflict again when Mankuruane, the Klaping chief, tried to expand east towards the Transvaal border. Boer mercenaries fought on both sides of this conflict, though historian Timothy Stapleton notes that Boer mercenaries on both sides curiously had never been able to inflict casualties on each other. Ultimately, Mankuruane was beaten into accepting a Transvaal brokered treaty in September 1882. The treaty granted farms to the Boer mercenaries involved and created the Republic of Stellaland. These Boer incursions violated the Pretoria Convention. Gladstone's opposition in Parliament demanded he enforce the Pretoria Convention and turn back these Boers. But Gladstone must have felt stuck in an impossible tightrope act of his own. Historian I.M. Cumpston writes, quote, "Faced with an inherited deficit and primarily concerned to restore solvency, Gladstone was hard-pressed first with the Irish, then with Egyptian business. Between 1881 and 1884, he was unready to consider an expedition either to the Transvaal or Bechuanaland, in spite of the growing disorder. His lifeless expositions of the extent of British commitment under the Pretoria Convention and his justifications of government's reluctance to act gave openings for opposition attack." End quote. Secretary Kimberley also voiced the tough decisions facing the Gladstone cabinet, saying, quote, "The difficulty of this country was that in dealing with South Africa as a native question, we had not the sympathies of the white population. Either we must hold South Africa strongly by force and maintain our policy, whether the colonists like it or not, or else we must acquiesce in a great many things being done in these colonies which the majority of the people in this country do not approve." End quote. Not only did the Gladstone cabinet want to avoid uniting Boers throughout South Africa against the British, they also wanted to avoid the expense of putting troops on the ground and the British public's criticism of that expense that would surely follow. But then, a wounded Englishman was murdered by Boer mercenaries. On July 31st, 1884, Christopher Bethell rode from Mafeking in command of 300 Barolong tribesmen to drive Boer mercenaries off Chief Monsoya's land again. Chief Monsoya's nephew, Israel Molema, and Englishman Nathan Walker accompanied this force. They initially drove a Boer detachment back, only to be driven to retreat themselves when Boer reinforcements arrived. Bethell and company trotted as fast as they could back to Mafeking, but then bullets tore through Molema's shoulder and Molema's horse. Bethell tried to lift Molema onto Bethell's still upright horse rather than leave Molema dashed against the ground. While Molema urged Bethell to escape, a bullet pierced the bridge of Bethell's nose, gouged out an eye, and broke his jawbone. Bethell collapsed. His horse escaped. Molema played dead. Then Molema reported afterward that, quote, "One Harrington, an Englishman, one of the freebooters, mercenaries, rode up to Bethell and said, 'Oh, you are Bethell. Do you remember saying to me at Kimberley that I would never get land here? How is it now?' Bethell said, 'Don't shoot me. You see I am badly wounded. I surrender as your prisoner. Take me to your camp.' Harrington replied, 'I won't.' Then two Boers, one named Joel van Rooyen, came up and said, 'So you are Bethell. Shall we shoot you?' Bethell, seeing no hope for him, said in despair, 'Shoot if you like.' After some taunts, they both shot him, both shots passing through his forehead, and as a matter of course, killing him instantly." End quote. Though this story is tragic, many of you may rightfully wonder why it matters to us. Bethell wound up in southern Africa because he fell into major debt while attending Cambridge University, because he was not good at gambling. His father sent Christopher away to the Cape Colony to save the family more embarrassment. Bethell became a lieutenant in the Bechuanaland West Field Force and took charge of the intelligence department. Bethell was charged with investigating claims by a young English boy named James Elcott, who escaped from a Boer family living in the Transvaal. Elcott claimed that he had been abducted from his own family and forced to work as an apprentice for Field Cornet Klein Mariko. Elcott's is the only recorded case of this virtual slavery being imposed on a white person. Bethell investigated this incident, but we don't ultimately know what happened from there. Bethell served in various mediator roles with ambiguous authority between native tribes, Boers, and the British. He established himself as a local store owner in Mafeking, beginning in 1879. Bethell earned the ire not only of the Boers, but also British officials wanting to keep the tenuous peace across South Africa, when he frequently demanded more British intervention in response to Boer theft of native cattle near the Transvaal's borderlands. Bethell's already tenuous influence took a major blow when the Bechuanaland West was absorbed by the Cape Colony. There went Bethell's official position on British payroll. He instead created a new title for himself, Barolong Agent. We'd be naive to think Bethell advocated for the Barolong just out of principle. There was financial incentive and compensation for him to do this. But his urging for British intervention against the Boers fell on increasingly deaf ears. Then, the Transvaal Rebellion broke out in 1880. Bethell worked his relationships with tribal leaders like Chief Monsoya to provide as much support to the British cause against the Transvaal as he could. Bethell attracted enduring Boer hostility by raising thousands of native tribesmen to fight for the British. But as you know, the Transvaal won more independence for themselves after this First Boer War. And as Monsoya and Bethell feared, Boers were emboldened to press their luck west. The Boer mercenaries and tribal allies drove Chief Monsoya's forces out of Loklaclane and the surrounding territory. Then they pressed their advantage to Mafeking. Without the same official recognition that Bethell had before as a British agent, he worked as Monsoya's agent to appeal to the British to make the Boers stop, to recruit Englishmen, to buy ammunition, to buy arms for Mafeking's defense. The British appealed to the Boers to make their mercenaries and agents stop. As you can imagine, the Boer invaders continued with impunity. Arming Monsoya's forces was prohibited. While Bethell was trying to collect evidence of legal standing for the murder of 15 prisoners of war by Boer mercenaries, the peace treaty with Monsoya's forged signature was ratified in 1882. The volunteers' commander, G. van Petius, proclaimed the surrender of Barolong land as the Republic of Goshen. The tribesmen in this republic didn't recognize the treaty, nor did Bethell. Bethell urged G. van Petius and company to leave Monsoya's land. They refused. Just 1 month after Joubert and company subjugated the Nzunza, Paul Kruger won his first of 4 presidential terms in August of 1883. Kruger left soon after, for London, with a delegation to renegotiate the Pretoria Convention. What was to be done about the Republic of Goshen would be addressed. Then, Bethell broke some more unwritten rules. He married a Tepo woman, one of Chief Monsoya's people. Bethell's family wouldn't recognize the marriage, or any offspring from the marriage. On the other hand, drama died down between Monsoya's Swane people and the Boers while both sides awaited the outcome of the London Convention. Reverend John Mackenzie of the London Missionary Society had already seen the ripple effects of stripping native Africans of their land just a few years earlier. Mackenzie wanted natives to develop as small-scale farmers or as laborers and believed they needed humanitarian treatment. So Mackenzie campaigned vigorously for British protection of the Swane people living west of the Transvaal. Kruger's delegation failed to achieve a free hand in this territory, thanks largely to Mackenzie's advocacy. Mackenzie became deputy commissioner to the Bechuanaland Protectorate. The British decided to establish a Bechuanaland Protectorate that included the land of chiefs Monsoya and Monkuruane. Bethell must have swelled with elation seeing his faith in British justice and his work for the Barolong vindicated. But G. van Petius wasn't finished yet. After hearing that a British protectorate was soon to be established, G. van Petius and his Boer mercenaries tried to take what they could from Monsoya's land. They destroyed corn crops until Bethell scrambled a force to drive out the Boer volunteers. Then Mackenzie returned to personally announce and verify the establishment of the Bechuanaland Protectorate. He announced severe punishment for any further theft or destruction of persons or property. But the Boer livestock raids continued in contempt of these announcements of British protection, despite official British promises of protection and despite the British government appealing to Boer officials to make this stop. It must have looked like more of the same was in store. More empty British warnings and threats, followed by more aggression, followed by more warnings and empty appeals to Transvaal officials. Further Boer raids continued from May into June, with more wounded Monsoya supporters being shot dead. But then, the wrong wounded Monsoya supporter was murdered, as already mentioned on July 31st, 1884. Though Bethell estranged himself from both Boer and Brit with his unwavering advocacy for the people of what would become the Bechuanaland, his murder was one of the major weights that tipped the scales in favor of stronger British intervention in Bechuanaland. But British intervention did not turn out to be all that the tribesmen could have hoped for. To ensure a steady flow of labor to diamond mines in Kimberley, the Boers of Stellaland saw their land claims ultimately recognized, so life for natives there grew bleak. However, British troops led by General Charles Warren ultimately arrived in Bechuanaland to remove the Boer mercenaries from Monsoya's territory. President Creer agreed not to support the Goshenites in any way, so Warren's troops met little resistance when they finally took hold of Bechuanaland in March 1885, with most mercenaries drifting back to the Transvaal before. Historian Andrew Manson records this about Christopher Bethell's funeral. Quote, Warren wasted no time in attending to the issue of Bethell's death. On March 14th, he visited Rooigrond and had his grave located and his body exhumed. It was declared that no abuse of the body had taken place after death, although how this was ascertainable so long after the event is difficult to comprehend. He then ordered that it be sent to Mafeking for reburial, the coffin being duly transported on a gun carriage covered with a Union Jack. In the afternoon of the same day, the funeral procession made its way to the site of burial, being joined by ever-growing numbers of mourners paying their last respects to a man they had loved, one who had befriended them, served them for 6 years, and laid down his life for them. The sight of so many people was a particularly moving experience for 2 of Bethell's brothers who had arrived in Mafeking for the funeral. End quote. The posthumous life of the rogue agent that was once estranged from so many British officials made an ironic burst through the finish line. Bethell's funeral, according to at least one historian, was one of the most expensive that the British government ever paid for. Bethell's wife, Teppo, gave birth to their daughter Grace 9 days after Bethell was murdered. What sadly would follow the Bethell family not recognizing Teppo's marriage to Christopher was the Bethell family not recognizing Grace as one of their own. They disinherited Grace, but Grace still attended Lovedale College in the Cape, according to her father's wishes. Grace married an Englishman in 1910 and moved to Bulawayo, and also, like her father, became beloved by the Barolong there. You heard about the British and the Transvaal ratifying the London Convention in 1884, just months before Christopher Bethell was murdered. Though Creer and company couldn't get a free hand in all the borderlands west of the Transvaal, their nation did get some wins. The London Convention cut the Transvaal's debt in half and gave the Transvaal a freer hand in dealing with African natives, among other wins for Transvaal leadership. Any explicit reference by name to British suzerain rights or suzerainty over the Transvaal was dropped. But, though this was an improvement in the Transvaal's eyes, the glass was not exactly full. Take this 4th provision as an example. Quote, the South African Republic will conclude no treaty or engagement with any state or nation other than the Orange Free State, nor with any native tribe to the eastward or westward of the Republic, until the same has been approved by Her Majesty the Queen. Such approval shall be considered to have been granted if Her Majesty's government shall not, within 6 months after receiving a copy of such treaty, which shall be delivered to them immediately upon its completion, have notified that the conclusion of such treaty is in conflict with the interest of Great Britain or any of Her Majesty's possessions in South Africa. End quote. The Transvaal had to get British permission to establish treaties with anyone else except the Orange Free State. So if the Transvaal wanted to get coastal land granted to them by, say, Portugal, and the British said no, getting this coastal land would technically be illegal under the London Convention. There is certainly historical debate over whether the London Convention actually asserted suzerainty. This 4th provision of the London Convention looks a lot like suzerainty to me, but I am a novice. Many respected historians have asserted that suzerainty was technically absent from this London Convention, historians such as DamianO'connor and Ian Smith. O'Connor argues in his Imperial Defense and Commitment to Empire book that Lord Derby scribbled out suzerainty during London Convention negotiations. Ian Smith writes this in The Origins of the South African War. Quote, notwithstanding the later attempts of Joseph Chamberlain and others to resurrect it by specious reasoning, British suzerainty over the Transvaal had, in fact, been abolished in 1884. End quote. It should be noted, though, that the Lord Derby who scribbled out suzerainty from the London Convention would later assert the following to the House of Lords. Quote, "Whatever suzerainty meant, the conditions of things it implied still remains, though the word is not distinctly employed." End quote. However, Derby made this statement much later, in 1897, after the situation in South Africa had changed dramatically. What is beyond dispute is that the South African Republic was the poorest of white settler states in South Africa when the London Convention was finalized. The British were the only great power on the South African scene. The British had been trying for decades to keep the Orange Free State and the Transvaal from gaining independent access to the sea, and thus from gaining independent access to trade outside Southern Africa. The British had been trying for decades to keep those Boer republics from expanding their borders too much, to where they could gain independent access to trade outside Southern Africa. But then a certain country across the Atlantic would complicate these plans. America. Okay, not America. It was another country across the English Channel who would complicate British designs for Southern Africa.